Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jim. On the last day of Black History Month, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Black history as it pertains to professional wrestling and some of the more famous and some of the less famous pioneers of professional wrestling. I two things I enjoy: Black history and wrestling. So let's dive directly into it. The first pioneer of professional wrestling, um, black pioneer of professional wrestling, I would say, is probably Bobo Brazil. Bobo Brazil breaks into the business in the mid 1950s and immediately trained by Joe Saboldi, already an athlete, playing uh, minor league, Negro League baseball at that time, but decides to try his hand at wrestling. And immediately he crafts the image of what it means to be a professional wrestler. It's not long after, in the mid 1950s, that he's challenging for the championship, and then he's holding on to mostly the United States Championship. And the United States Championship at that time was a very important and prestigious title. It was a stepping stone to the NWA World Heavyweight title. And then in 1963, he becomes the first man to defeat um, uh, Buddy Rogers for the NWA Heavyweight Championship. Later, the decision is reversed by the NWA board, and generally, historians of the NWA title don't necessarily count his win as champion, but hell, I'm counting it. So, and then we go to another gentleman, Bearcat Wright. Bearcat Wright broke into the business in the also in the 1950s. He's the son. He was the son of the mid 1950s. He was the son of Bearcat Wright, the boxer, and initially when he was boxing, he was Bearcat Wright Jr. He broke in the in the Indiana territories from Gary, Indiana, 5 days before Martin Luther King gave his famous speech. Um, I Have a Dream speech and March on Washington in 1963. Bearcat Wright told a packed out audience in Gary, Indiana, which was then a predominantly African American town, that he's not performing in a segregated place anymore. He's no longer doing that. So that was 63. In 1961, the Dick the Bruiser's territory had broken away thanks to disputes with um, with the NWA. They became the first, well, the second promotion to break away from the NWA. The first promotion, of course, was the AWA in 1960 with Gagne. But the WWA became the second promotion to break away. So basically, they had their own world champion, which um, Bearcat Wright challenged for in 1961 and defeated Killer Kowalski to win it. So he became the first black world heavyweight champion, even before Bobo Brazil. Even if you count Bobo Brazil's run in '63, beating Buddy Rogers, and you don't, even if you count that, Bearcat Wright still comes first. Now, a guy who comes even before them, when he wins the Negro Championship. The Negro Championship was established in the 1940s, but was held by a man named Jack Nichols, and that is Sweet Daddy Siki. Sweet Daddy Siki. He was born in New Mexico. He started, wrestled a little bit in California, but really gained his stride in Canada. He worked for Maple Leaf Wrestling, the Tunnies. Um, in Toronto, he worked for Stu Hart in Calgary. He worked all over Canada. He was blonde hair. He got it from Etta James. But he, in 1959, won the Negro Championship from Jack Nichols. was the initial, like I said, the initial Negro champion way back in the 40s. So, and then he goes on to himself challenge. He went on to go challenge Gene Kaninsky, famous Canadian champion of the NWA. Then he went on to go challenge, I think, even Bruno Sammartino when Bruno Sammartino had come to certain territories, especially St. Louis. I mean, not St. Louis. Yeah, Bruno had come through St. Louis, but I think he and Sweet Daddy Siki really got it on when Bruno was in Toronto from 60 to 61 after they blacklisted him in the American territories. So, and another person I wanted to talk about, Ethel Johnson. Ethel Johnson, just like her other cohorts, breaking into the business in the late 1940s and early 50s with her sister. Um, she she wrestled mostly tag matches in the beginning, but she was so athletic and so different with her gimmick that they pushed her to wrestle in singles competition. She wrestled the likes of June Byers, the likes of Penny Banner, the likes of Mildred Burke. She even challenged Mildred Burke in the early 60s for the NWA Women's Championship. And she went down to Latin America where she wrestled as Lisa Rose in a Latin American gimmick. But she was super athletic. She was inducted posthumously into the Hall of Fame in 2021. And it fit because that was the year WrestleMania 37 where Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair main evented night one of WrestleMania, honoring black women in the business. Okay, now we get to the more popular examples, the ones that we know. And a funny other thing about Bearcat Wright, when he went to the Los Angeles territory, he actually in '63 he actually beat the champion there, and and he didn't want to surrender the title. He went off script and he actually beat the guy. So they brought out the shooter who halfway owned the promotion, Judo Gene LaBelle, to come beat him up. Bearcat Wright, he was a guy that he stood up for his rights. He wasn't going to be pushed around. He wasn't going to be laid around. You know what I mean? Similar to what I was saying yesterday about Thunderbolt Patterson. But anyway, you get to some of these other wrestlers that we know about. Um, in the more popular, the more modern era. Of course, uh, because Sweet Daddy Siki was so popular in Stu Hart's promotion and so popular in Canada in general, they always looked for other guys to push. Another example of that would be Luther Lindsay, right? Or the guy I'm thinking about, Bad News Allen. Bad News Allen, a judo champion, actually went to the Olympics as a judo player, trained in Japan as a professional wrestler, and got a lot of his big breaks working for Stu Hart. He had the first ladder match in the late 1970s, early 1980s with Bret Hart. And then finally, they got a hold of him in the WWF and he became Bad News Brown. And he was there for a while. He had a couple of memorable angles. One at a SummerSlam. It was a SummerSlam match between him and Jake the Snake Roberts, in which he brings a Harlem Rat when Jake the Snake Roberts brings his snake. Then there was another angle at WrestleMania 6 where Roddy Piper painted himself half black, and mocked Bad News Brown. Then there was the other angle where supposedly Bad News Brown was going to be the first black guy to win the WWF Championship, but it went nowhere. He was his persona really inspired the persona of Stone Cold Steve Austin, because unlike other wrestlers, Bad News Brown wouldn't side with the heels just because they were heels. He would beat up on heels as well as baby faces. I like Bad News, the semifinalist of the WrestleMania 4 Battle Royal. But again, coming down to him and Bret Hart. Um, who's another guy? Natural Butch Reed. Of course, the Natural Butch Reed, a very big star, starting off in the Florida territory. One of those guys, like Ron Simmons, like Hulk Hogan, like Scott Hall, like Lex Luger, like so many others, trained by Hiro Matsuda, trained by him, starting off in that territory, and was pretty good in that territory. But when he moved up to Mid South, was when he really met his match, and he and the Junkyard Dog had some knockdown dragouts, as well as the knockdown dragouts that he had with Dick Slater, in that territory as well, managed by Dark Journey. And then when JYD left and went to the WWF, they tried to put him with they tried to put him as a babyface, but he just didn't work as a babyface. Then he comes to New York. He leaves too. He comes to New York. He's managed by the Doctor of Style, Slick. He has his WrestleMania moment when he and Coco Ware are wrestling at at WrestleMania 3, and uh, and basically Coco Ware chases Slick out of the arena. But then, and he was supposed to win after WrestleMania. He was supposed to win the Intercontinental Championship from uh, from Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat, of course, that great match with Macho Man Randy Savage. But Vince tells him he doesn't want him to take time off. So they're looking for another champion. So they choose Butch Reed. He's on a roll. He's called the Natural Butch Reed at this time. In Mid South, he was called Hacksaw Butch Reed. So they said, but then Butch Reed doesn't show up. He no shows. So they give it to the Honky Tonk Man, who in his gimmick became the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time. Whatever. Okay, another example. More examples. Sweet Georgia Brown, phenomenal women's wrestler in the 50s and 60s, mostly just like with the Johnson sisters, working together with Buddy Wolf and then later the fabulous Moolah. There are some speculation that Moolah made her do things that she didn't want to, that Moolah was unethical. When the stuff came out about Moolah, the sexual abuse allegations about Moolah, Georgia Brown was named in that. But hey, Buddy Wolf, who was the trainer for the girls in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, kind of did the same thing to some of these girls. You know, when they first broke in, the Penny Banners, uh, the Judy Gables, um, the girls, the Mildred Burks, the girls like that. I believe he was in a relationship or married to Mildred Burke. I don't know, but yeah. And then you have on the promoter side. On the promoter side, one of the most famous promoters in the Northeastern Territory was James Dudley, who was in charge of the Washington, D.C. area, basically the brain hub, the brain trust of the Northeastern Combine. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame, I believe, in 1995, if I'm not mistaken. He was a very close friend of Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon would even keep him, 1994, Vince McMahon would even keep him on the payroll for years and years because Vince took care of the old timers. He took care of the Captain Lou's, the Mr. Fuji's, the Arnold Scullins, the Gorilla Monsoons, all those types of people that his father loved and cared and adored, you know. And James Dudley was one of them. Okay, now we go into the 80s, the 70s, rather. 70s producing a lot of black athletes because the world is changing, you know, black empowerment, black consciousness, the civil rights movement, the black power movement, the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, all that sort of stuff is coalescing and that's impacting professional wrestling to the point that the first time in the late 1970s that Ray Candy, who was then known as Ray Candy, changes his name to Kareem Muhammad, becomes a militant Muslim, pack the New Orleans Silverdome. This is the early 80s, like 79, 80, with the Junkyard Dog. It was because he became this militant, and Dog was presented as the opposite of him. Likewise, the Big Cat Ernie Ladd comes into the New York territory as a challenge to Bobo Brazil, a slick talker. And he was, and Big Cat Ernie Ladd, being that he came from a football career, he wasn't afraid to use racial stereotypes against the likes of Bobby McDaniel, against the likes of any Japanese wrestler, and any other black wrestler, basically calling up other black wrestlers Toms and Queens and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Especially when he was wrestling Bobo Brazil. Just like when Butch Reed was wrestling in the ghetto street fights, Junkyard Dog, he was not afraid to call him any of that. And Rocky Johnson enters into the industry. Tony Atlas enters into the industry, which would factor in to them becoming the first black tag team champions in the WWE in 1983. Moving on, you have Abdullah the Butcher, you have Kamala. These are like silly gimmicks. These are like African savage gimmicks. You even have when Tony Atlas comes back to the WWE in the early 90s, Saba Simba. That kind of thing. That kind of silliness. But there was silliness in all types of races. And then by the 90s, you have the Nation of Domination, you have all these other wrestlers. And then by the 2000s, you have Crime Time, you have Titus O'Neil and Darren Young, but you don't have any champions. The Rock became champion in 1998 for the first time at the Survivor Series. Probably one of the best pieces of business that the WWF was doing at that time. But after that, you have just basically a drought until WrestleMania 35 when Kofi Kingston makes history, becoming the first black man ever to hold the WWE Championship. Mark Henry did pretty well in his run in the late 2000s. After getting away from Sexual Chocolate with the Hall of Pain thing, Mark Henry really came into his own. But that's it. I just wanted to talk about some of the black wrestlers that I like and pay in respects to those black wrestlers that we don't really know much about. We don't really acknowledge. Big shout out to also Sailor R. Thomas, who was a huge star in the Detroit territory at one point. Big shout out to like I said, Thunderbolt Patterson. Big shout out to, I mentioned Luther Lindsay. Big shout out to Ice Train, who passed away not so long ago. Ice Train wasn't that skilled in the ring. He had that one tag team with himself and Fire and Ice in WCW with Scott Norton. He wasn't a beast in the ring, but he was decent. He had a good look to him. Rest in peace. Condolences to his family. But yeah, there have been a lot of great black wrestlers, and there have also been wrestlers that are just spot fest guys. You know what I mean? Guys like Shelton Benjamin. Like, they're in every Money in the Bank, and they do really well, but they never really get over. MVP he's great on the mic. Anyway, guys, gotta hit the work. Love you guys. Peace.